perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Again, I'm Harry Greenberger, and I'm still here after all these years. Today we have a very interesting guest who has been with us on other occasions, and it's Marjorie Esman, who is for 5 years now, has been the executive director of the Louisiana ACLU. In addition to that, Marjorie has a law degree from Tulane, holds a PhD in anthropology from Tulane University, and has taught at Tulane, LSU, and the University of Southwestern Louisiana. So, Marjorie, welcome.
It's always a pleasure. And, always glad to be here.
And we know your organization and our New Orleans Secular Humanist Association have a number of matters of common interest to us. Number one on the list being separation of church and state. Not the only matter. So I'm just going to ask you to sort of tell us about what's been going on and what you're looking forward to, matters that you think would be of interest to our people.
Well, that's a lot.
I don't doubt that.
You know, I could probably stay here all day and talk about that, but I don't have all day.
We don't have all day. That's right.
You know, the ACLU, I imagine most of your audience knows this already. The ACLU is the country's largest organization dedicated to the defense of civil liberties, and the only one that defends all rights for all people. We're not just a one-issue organization. We don't just protect one constituency. We do everything for everybody, and that gives us a huge agenda.
And it also may cause some conflicts when people say, why do you want to defend those people?
Well, we get a lot of that, and sometimes, frankly, we're in conflict with ourselves. You know, we have one policy that offends another policy. Of course, we get this a lot with hate speech, you know, where we have, you know, we protect people's rights to say things even if we don't like what it is that they have to say. That came up recently in the case involving the Bourbon Street preachers who, during Southern Decadence, who were out there on Bourbon Street in violation of what we knew to be and what a judge declared to be an unconstitutional city ordinance that prohibited essentially amplified religious speech and political speech on Bourbon Street. So when these preachers were arrested for preaching hatred on, during Southern Decadence, they were homophobic messages that they were preaching. And although I have to say that the client that we represent, there were 3 lawsuits filed, and the ACLU's client was not preaching homophobia, but it wouldn't have mattered if she was. But in fact, she wasn't. But the messages are all, anti-gay messages, and yet, they have the First Amendment right to speak what they want to speak, to profess their religion, even in public on Bourbon Street during Southern Decadence.
And you're saying that has already been adjudicated?
Well, there was a restraining order granted against further enforcement of the ordinance, and it's right now pending some negotiations for the city to rewrite the ordinance. I went and testified against it when they adopted it in 2011. I told them they can't turn Bourbon Street into a constitution-free zone. And they went ahead and passed it anyway. And I said, when we sue you, we will win. And we did, and we did.
Is there any kind of law against hate speech? Because that is hate speech.
Is there a law against hate speech? There are penalties, enhanced penalties for what are called hate crimes, and that is something that the ACLU does not support because that's kind of thought control. If I commit a crime against you, the crime I have committed against you is no different, according to whatever I was thinking at the time. You're no more dead if I kill you because, I hate secular humanists than you would be if I kill you because I just don't happen to like Harry Greenberger. Neither of which is true, by the way.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that. Thank you.
But you see the point. And,
yes.
And so from an ACLU standpoint, speech is speech, and nobody has a constitutional right not to have their feelings hurt or not to hear something that they don't want to hear. And certainly the right for free speech, is paramount. So our position is that speech is speech, and we defend the speech, not necessarily the message, and we will draw that distinction when appropriate.
Okay, so that's one issue that is actually not totally resolved. What else of recent vintage are you concerned with?
We have a long-standing, multi-year initiative to reform the criminal justice system in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and statewide.
Reform it. All right. What does that mean?
Well, Louisiana, not everybody knows this, but Louisiana is the incarceration capital of the world. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world here in Louisiana. And apart from the fact that has not reduced the crime rate, so clearly it's not very effective. And it's enormously expensive, both in terms of financial resources and in human cost. We have people locked up for long periods of time for committing relatively minor offenses.
Such as drug use?
Drug use, that's right. That's the perfect example is 3 strikes drug use. You get somebody who's got an addiction problem, and after a 3rd offense, they may be sent to prison for life when what they really need is help.
At the time of the first offense.
At the time of the first offense, that's
yes.
right. If they have an addiction problem, they need help for their addiction.
And when you say you want to reform that system, what would you want them to do to someone who was arrested, say, on possession of a drug or even possession to sell? Should that be a crime?
Well, that's a different issue.
All right.
The question of legalization is also a complicated topic. We would support legalization of most, if not all, drugs. Tax them, regulate them, provide support services for people with addiction problems and substance abuse problems, which will, of course, bring in enormous tax revenues rather than be a drain on our resources now to fight a war on drugs that has been a losing battle for decades.
It has been.
But that's not a fight we can win, certainly not in the immediate future.
Not yet. Well, now, but what would you have the system do to someone who was picked up for possession?
Well, certainly, and New Orleans has done this. New Orleans has reformed its scheme so that now if you're picked up on a first offense, possession of marijuana, you get, instead of being arrested and sent to Orleans Parish Prison where you don't belong, you get a citation. It's like a ticket. And you have to go to court and you pay your fine. And that's been a huge improvement because it's kept people out of the prison system who don't need to be there. It's reduced the cost of our jail by not locking up people who don't need to be locked up, taken resources, being able to redirect police resources to the really important crimes that they need to be solving instead of petty things that they don't. We would hope that we could expand that statewide.
Okay.
There's also a movement on the part of several sheriffs statewide to build bigger prisons. They have this idea that if we build bigger jails, we can lock up more people and make our communities safer. And of course, the reverse has been shown to be true. Larger jails and locking up more people actually tends to make communities more dangerous and not more safe because when you get somebody into the criminal justice system, particularly for a low-level offense, that person then has a criminal record. It makes it harder for them to get employment in the future. it destabilizes their family, because while the person is locked up, the family loses all of the benefits of, they lose the income stream from employment, they lose the emotional resources, the second parent in the home, all of those things. And it makes the family more poor and therefore more likely to be subject to crime. If you're poor and can't earn a living legally, then you have no choice but to earn a living illegally, and so it actually increases the crime rate.
So you're opposed to for building more prisons.
Well,
but that means that you have to reduce the number of people that would have been sent to the prison. And what reform do you have in mind to do that?
Well, I want to say we're not opposed to more prisons in general. I mean, there are some instances where more prisons are necessary. We have some facilities that are very old, that are outdated, that are in terrible condition, and they need to be replaced. So we're not saying, no more money to build prisons. What we're saying is that you have to scale them appropriately and not use them as economic engines for the community and say, oh, well, we can employ all these people and bring in all this money by locking up more folks. One approach is to reduce penalties for certain low-level offenses, as we were just discussing. Another thing that we've been working on, with some success actually in the state legislature, is to expand the opportunities for parole for people who are in prison for sometimes more serious offenses, but who maybe have been in for a long period of time, who have demonstrated that they are no longer dangerous to society, and that we would all be better served by having those people back in the community.
And you said you're having some success in the legislature. What is that?
Well, for the past 2 years, in 2011 and 2012, we were able to pass bills to provide parole opportunities for people who otherwise would not have had them. One of them, the first one that we did in 2011, was for aging prisoners, for people who are 60 and older, who may have been sentenced to life without parole, which means they would never have been eligible for a parole hearing. But with the recommendation of the warden, if you've achieved the age of 60 and certain other benchmarks, you have a good disciplinary record, you've earned a GED if it's appropriate, certain other things, you can get a parole hearing and demonstrate that it's safe for you to be reduced to the community, go back and live with your family, or in a facility where you can be cared for. It saves an enormous amount of money, and for people who still have the ability to work, they can get a job, become taxpayers again. And in acting on that success that we had in 2011, in 2012, we were able to pass something that was even more ambitious, which also and this is for nonviolent offenders only. So these are people, we're not talking about the mass murderers here. We're talking about people like the three strikes drug offenders, or other relatively minor offenses, but who for whatever reason have life without parole sentences. We now have a bill that was passed, and the governor signed it, to provide parole, the opportunity for parole hearings for people. It's a sliding scale depending on how old you were at the time of your offense and how much time you've served. So if you were 18 at the time of your offense, you have to have served, I think it's either 20 or 25 years, I can't remember the specifics. And if you're a little bit older, a lesser amount of time. And again, you have to have a GED, you have to have job skills, you have to have a good disciplinary record in prison. But with all of those things, we can get people who are deemed safe back into the community to work, to rejoin their families, and it's really a win for everybody.
Well, with those new laws in place, is your organization then representing people in prison to take advantage of the new paroles, or do they get their own attorneys?
Well, we don't do that.
How does it work?
Okay, well, we don't do individual criminal defense because we don't have the resources to do that. But I know that there is at least one attorney that I've spoken to who said he's gotten several people out on the first one that we did in 2011 for older prisoners, and the other one, it only went into effect on August 15th, so there hasn't been a lot of time. But there are private lawyers, and of course the inmates can do it themselves. I mean, they have a very good network of information. They know what their rights are, and they can seek their own parole hearings, and many of them do. So I think over time we're really going to see people being released on these bills, and we are right now trying to put together our strategy for the 2013 legislative session, so I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like. But there will be more efforts to expand parole opportunities and to reduce, as we call them, front end and back end. Back end is to help people who are already in get out when it's safe and appropriate to do so. And the other is front end, to keep people who don't deserve to be in the system in the first place, to keep them from getting into the system.
Is it? Do you have an opinion about the parole board itself? If someone makes their appeal, do you think they will get a good hearing?
I don't have an opinion on that. I know there have been some changes to the parole board. They've merged the parole and pardons board into one. It used to be two, and I think that's a good thing because it streamlines things. It always depends, of course, on who's there, but I think the system is set up so that, at least on paper, people ought to be able to get fair hearings. And the rest of it, of course, it always depends on the human beings, but I think it's a fair system.
Good. Now, what other matters would you like to tell us about?
Well, one of the things that the ACLU on a national organizational scale has been working very hard on, and we're very proud of some of the successes we've had, is on the movement to repeal that terrible Clinton-era bill, DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act.
I was going to ask you about DOMA, Defense of Marriage, which means they passed into law something that says marriage is between one man and one woman. Is that what we're talking about?
And what it says is this is a federal law, which in itself is an inappropriate, unconstitutional restriction on the rights of states, that says that marriages in a state that recognizes same-sex marriage, it started in Massachusetts, and of course we've seen it grow, are not recognized either by the federal government, and states don't have to recognize those marriages if it's illegal in their own state. So in a state like Louisiana, which does not recognize same-sex marriage, a same-sex marriage performed in New York or Massachusetts or other places where it's legal is not considered valid here.
When they passed that DOMA, was it by a large majority or just barely?
I don't remember. I hope it was just barely, but I really just don't remember.
But now, is there someone for the next session have a bill to reverse that?
Well, that's not the way it's going to die. The way it's going to die is in the Supreme Court. And there are several cases now pending for hearing before the Supreme Court. They have to, we call it grant cert, which means the Supreme Court has to agree to hear these cases, but I don't think there's any question that they will. One of which is an ACLU case, and it's sort of amazing. You can't get more compelling facts than this one. It was two women in New York. They were together 40 years. They were married in Canada before it was legal for them to marry in the United States. Came back to New York as legally married couple, and then one of them died. And as spouses do, she left her estate to her spouse, her legally married spouse. And but because the federal government, and by that time New York had passed its own version of same-sex marriage, and so in the state of New York they were considered married because they were legally married in Canada. But the federal government didn't recognize it, and therefore the surviving spouse had to pay some $300,000 in estate taxes that she would not have had to pay if she had been married to a man instead of a woman.
Yes.
This is an elderly woman, 80 plus, had to sell her home. It was devastating. And clearly, if that's not discrimination, I'm not quite sure what discrimination looks like if it doesn't look like that.
And you expect cases on that matter to come up in the next session of the Supreme Court? Well,
yes. Her name is Edith Windsor, and it's Windsor versus United States. She won her lawsuit in the New York federal courts and is now petitioned the Supreme Court to hear her appeal. A little bit out of normal sequence, that's kind of legal technicalities, but that one, and there's another case out of California, which I don't think is an ACLU case, but it's a woman, also two women. One of them worked for the federal court system and wanted to put her spouse on her federal health benefits. And again, if she'd had a husband, there would have been no question. But they said, no, the federal system doesn't recognize same-sex marriages, so she was denied the right to get federal health care. And they have sued also. So we've got these two cases working their way up. And I think of course, we're hoping that the Supreme Court's going to do the right thing on this.
What a lot of people don't understand is that on the federal level, as long as that same-sex marriage is not considered legal, you lose a lot of things like the spouse's Social Security, which if it were heterosexual marriage, one of them died, the other one would still qualify
That's
for
right.
it. And the one you mentioned about the estate going. And there are
over 1,000 things built into federal law that protect spouses.
Yes.
Everything from, as you described, the Social Security benefits to all kinds tax. Claiming the marital tax exemption on your tax returns,
Yes.
being able to file joint tax returns.
If the Supreme Court overturns DOMA, then where are we?
Well, what that means is that states like Louisiana will have to recognize the validity of marriages that were legally performed elsewhere.
But that still doesn't give the federal sanction.
Well, I think it would be part of the remedy. I think it would be part of the remedy is that the federal government would have, because these two cases attack both aspects of that. And so the federal system would have to recognize, as in the case of Edith Windsor, that she was in fact legally married to her wife, and that and they're petitioning for her to get her money back.
So if the Supreme Court considers that unconstitutional, which that will probably be appealed, but if they do...
Well, it can't be after the Supreme Court's ruled. I mean, they're the
Okay.
final say.
Right.
They're it.
All right. Let's say that they do find it unconstitutional. At that point, automatically, would same-sex marriage be legal across the country?
Well, yes and no. It would not require states like Louisiana to perform those marriages because each state is entitled to decide what marriage within its state is going to look like. So you can set your own minimum age at which people have to marry without parental consent. You can set limits on, cousins and all of those other things. So it would not mean that same-sex couples could get legally married in Louisiana, but it would mean that Louisiana would have to recognize as married people who get legally married in other places where it is allowed.
Okay, that sounds good. Tell us something else you're working on or looking at.
Well, let's see. Some other, we've been very concerned with immigration issues. Which, last year the Supreme Court essentially struck down that horrible law out of Arizona that we call the driving while brown law that allowed local officials to detain anybody that they thought was illegally present in this country and arrest them for not having proof of their legal presence here.
In other words, someone who looked foreign or maybe had darker skin.
Which always meant, looking Hispanic. That's right, particularly in Arizona. That's what it looked like. And one of the problems is that, of course, you and I we're not required to carry proof of our legal right to be in this country.
I don't even know if you're legal, but go ahead.
Well, I was born in this country, so, and I have a birth certificate that says so, but there's nothing that requires me to carry that.
Yes.
And I have a U.S. passport, but there's nothing that requires me to carry it, and I don't.
Yes.
And so if somebody were to stop me and ask me to prove that I have the legal right to live in this country, I couldn't do it. And yet, they were arresting people who looked like they might be foreign, who didn't have that documentation. And the Supreme Court essentially, they upheld parts of the law which said that, yes, if somebody's not legally allowed to be in this country, they can be detained by local law enforcement. But you can't use physical appearance, racial profiling, as an excuse to stop somebody and ask them to prove their legal presence here.
Okay.
Which is, obviously very important. We don't want police to say, you look suspicious because you have brown skin and therefore I'm going to stop you.
But didn't some other states then adopt that same law that they had in Arizona?
Well, Louisiana has a version of it. But of course, again, the racial profiling aspect of it was struck down. So cops can't just stop you because they think you look brown. And we're working on, we've had some complaints about that fact pattern, people being, and then of course what happens is that you lock them up on some pretext and then sent them to be deported. And so we're looking at that issue in Louisiana. We've got complaints from various parts of the state, and it's something that we're trying to wrap up, get the right case to put it in position for litigation, and we're not there yet, but it's something we're very concerned about.
Before we run out of time, What about in Louisiana matters of religion in public schools? What's happening there, or what?
The perennial problem of religion in public schools. Yes,
for which our state is probably the leading violator.
Well, or at least high up on the list.
Right.
That's right.
What's happening now?
Well, we get constant complaints about that, from the principals trying to give out Bibles to kids being told that, if you have a question about religion, the church bus can pick you up and bring you back home again. There's the case out of Texas of the cheerleaders with the religious signs that the cheerleaders had, and the federal court in Texas for now is allowing them to keep the signs as a matter of the free speech rights of the cheerleaders, which I think is the wrong position. But the problem that we have here is while we get complaints about this all the time, it's very difficult to get a plaintiff who is brave enough to want to litigate these issues. And I don't blame them, even though we do these things anonymously, we do John Doe lawsuits, but still in a small town, people tend to know who's who.
People know, yes.
People know, and they get subject to all kinds of harassment and sometimes worse, and so it's very difficult to find somebody with the courage to stand up and actually file a lawsuit. So we know that there are all sorts of abuses, but unless somebody's brave enough to step forward and litigate them, there's nothing we can do about it.
Okay, Marjorie, we got a couple minutes left.
Okay.
Tell our folks anything you want them to hear.
Well, as I say, it's really hard to sum up the work that we do, but in Louisiana, the ACLU, we're smaller than people think we are. We have a staff of 6, full-time staff of 6, and a half-time person in Shreveport, which has been great for us. We have one litigating lawyer, which is why we can't do nearly as much as we wish we did. We have to do serious triage in the cases that we handle because I don't litigate anymore. We have one lawyer who does. We get about 1,500 complaints a year for our services, and so, it's hard for us to keep up with the workload.
All right. Well, I'm sure that your capacity depends upon your funding.
Always.
And you
Always.
depend upon people who would like to contribute to the ACLU.
The generosity of our supporters, absolutely.
How do they go about doing that? If you folks want to support the ACLU,
yes,
what do they do?
Best thing is to go to our website, and I know you want people to say this twice, so our website is laaclu.org. That's laaclu.org, and you go there, and there's a little thing that says donate. We make it very easy for you. We also we have 2 corporations. We've got the one that you can get a tax deduction for your donations, and then there's what we call the card-carrying membership arm, which funds our legislative, our lobbying work. And we like people to do both. You can a basic membership costs $25, and you get your ACLU card. And then if you want to, be more generous with your donations, get the tax deduction for it, you click on the donate side.
Good. All right, Marjorie, we got to go. I want to thank all you folks for watching our show. We appreciate your being here, and we hope you'll stick with us and watch our shows in the future.